There's a Sunday school teacher who asked her kids, talking about church, and said, it's really important that you're quiet in church. And do you know why it's necessary to be quiet in church? And the little girl said, because all the people are sleeping. And our goal today is to make sure you don't sleep. But if you do, we want you to have a nice nap knowing that everything you need to hear and know gently filters into your mind. So last Monday was Martin Luther King Day. And, we honor Martin Luther King because he was a courageous man and he wanted to see change in this world. And like Gandhi, he wanted change to happen peacefully. There's an organization called AGENT, the Association for Global New Thought, that unity and other new thought and other religions participate in, and they sponsor something called the Season for Nonviolence. And it runs for 64 days from January 30th to April 14th. These are memorial anniversary dates for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and for Gandhi. And this year I'm mentioning it because it starts this week, and because somewhere way back I wrote down this little phrase, "Can you be peace?" And that floated up to be this week's talk title. And so it always makes me feel so in awe when the universal mind of God works in the background to align the stars and my talk title. And so we went on the cruise, and when we got back, and there's all this talk about the terror attacks in France. And then we got off the boat, and we were in the car, and we heard that there was a shooting at the Melbourne Square Mall. And I've heard a number of people say, wow, that's close to home. I can't believe that it happened here. Have any of you said that or thought that? I got an email from Reverend Ellen Debenport, and she wrote the book, The 5 Principles, and it's the book that Maggie's using in her class, and some of you are taking that class. And she wrote about the terror attacks in France. And she was pondering about the consciousness here on the planet. And she was pondering, what is the difference between murder and terror? And she said, why didn't we call this that happened in France another mass shooting? It's not the first time that someone walked into a business and opened fire. And that's why you and I are familiar with terms like disgruntled former employee, going postal. I worked at the Anchorage Daily News, and in May of 1987, a former employee walked in and opened fire. So Ellen was reflecting about the distinction being in the motive. She said that murder is triggered by greed, jealousy, and revenge. But if someone kills for religious reasons, we now call it terror. And she goes on to say that this means that religious people are the most feared people on this planet. Wow. As I pondered and reflect on that, I know that it does not mean that those people who are spiritual are the most feared. And I really don't think it's religious people that are the most feared. It's hard for me to believe that it's really about religion per se, because all the world's religions profess love, and they profess God and love for one another. Yet in truth, throughout history, there's been those who have thought that their religion, their belief system, their way of life, their creed, their values were the only ones that were right or correct. You know, these attacks in France were particularly riveting because there were so many journalists there. You know, there was lots of reporters in France, lots of international reporters, and so it was all broadcast. We were getting to see it almost live. And I try to keep that in perspective when I see that horror. I try to keep in perspective that more people are killed every day in non-religious, non-sectarian violence. Non-religious or sectarian, I meant that way. 17 people dead in 3 days. Wow. And yet, in the midst of the crisis, and in the midst of every crisis that we see, there are always people doing the right thing. There was the young African Muslim man at the Jewish supermarket who hid hostages in the walk-in cooler. Just as we had a hero here in Melbourne, someone who lost his life trying to protect someone else. And we have our soldiers, our policemen, our firemen, who are always putting themselves in harm's way to protect us. And yet that comment that I keep hearing, what is the world? Yeah. And what Ellen said in her email and what I say is that in spite of the violence we see on TV, I remain convinced that consciousness of the world is overall rising. That what we see on the news are the aberrations, not what's normal. The news capitalizes on what's different. So you say, Reverend Beth, if we're progressing as a human race, what does it mean when we have these continual outbursts and these outbreaks of war or religious violence? And what unity teaches us and what we learned when we did our E² series about quantum physics is that our lives and everything we see on the planet reflects our collective consciousness. So everything I see reflects my consciousness. Everything we see reflects our consciousness. Maybe say that with me. Everything we see reflects our consciousness. Take a deep breath. That means that violence and religious intolerance lurks inside all of us. The terrorists in France are merely expressing out into the world that which lives in all of us. It's sort of like a volcano venting steam. And you know, on TV we saw those crowds marching, and many of them were carrying signs that said, "I am Charlie." And if we were there, would we do the same? I am Charlie. But wouldn't we also need to be carrying the sign that says we are terrorists? Take a deep breath. Now, I'm not saying that you are evil or violent. But like my friend Ellen says, some thread, some strand of violence and intolerance has to run through all of us. Or terror attacks would not be part of our collective experience. Sometimes the violence or the intolerance shows up when we talk about those Muslims, those Jews, those Catholics, those Baptists, those Unitics. When we gossip, when we're indifferent and cold, when we see somebody hungry and we don't do something to feed them, that is that strand of inhumanity. How many of us have seen people be ruthless in business? And we say, well, it's just business. And so the question is, what is ours to do? What is mine to do? What is yours to do? And I say that ours is to be peace. It's up to us, you and me, to be the change that we want to see. We've said that all along. It's been be the change you want to see. It's up to us to let peace begin with us individually here and now. We sing the peace song at the end of every service. Let peace begin with me. In the Bible, in the book of Acts, in the 27th chapter, there is an accounting of an episode in the Apostle Paul's life. And he and some others were sailing in a violent storm called a nor'easter. I think our neighbors up in the north had one of those this weekend. And at first, on the boat, they fought the winds, but they soon found that they couldn't face them, and so they gave up and they just let themselves be driven along. And as they were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo in order to lighten the load. And as time passed, they even tossed the ship's tackle overboard. And finally, they had lost their way and their hope as days passed without being able to see the sun or the stars. And the stars, of course, were the means by which they navigated. And at that point, Paul counseled the others. I'm sure he was the voice of peace, to take nourishment. This is your preservation. They had not eaten for several days. So after they ate, they were strengthened. And then they threw the wheat overboard to lighten the load. And they saw that the ship was beginning to run aground, so they cut off the anchors and they put up the sails and they headed for the finally visible shore. And the ship was wrecked. But every one of them reached the shore. And I bet they were very grateful to put their feet on that solid ground. And there's some of those things in the story that you and I can take as we take that story metaphysically. There's some little things that they did that you and I can do to be peace. One of the things is when the storm became so strong, they quit resisting. Sometimes the greatest pain for us is in the resisting. How often do we have to say, let go and let God? It's hard, isn't it? I want those people at Everest to move out. But resistance requires us to look at what is and to accept it. It doesn't bring us any closer to peace to ignore, to suppress, or to deny what is happening outside of us or inside of us. But we have to just shine the light and look at what's happening and say, okay, this is what it is. And most of you know our friend Martha Creek, who's been here the last couple of years. She'll be back in March, and she's going to be talking and reminding us about loving what is. For us to have peace in our lives, particularly when there's storms that we face, or we face adversity, we have to trust God. And we have to trust that God has given us everything we need to face any situation. And so it was just amazing that was part of my talk, and the last thing we were singing is more than enough. More than enough. Okay, Beth, we've got more than enough. We can do this. In the past, I've told you the story about Roger Crawford, and Roger Crawford had everything he needed to play tennis except for 2 hands and a leg. And when his parents saw him for the first time, they saw a baby with a thumb-like projection out of his right forearm and a thumb and a finger out of his left forearm. No hands, just 2 little finger projections. No palms. His arms and legs were shortened. He had only 3 toes on his shrunken right foot, and his left leg was withered, and that was later amputated. He suffered from what is called ectrodactylism. Affects 1 out of every 90,000 children born in the United States. And the doctor said that Roger would never be able to walk or care for himself. But you know, Roger's parents didn't believe the doctor. They believed in that more than enough. And so they never taught him that he was handicapped. They had never allowed him to feel sorry for himself. Once he got in trouble because his school papers were late, and he asked his dad to write a letter for him, because after all he had to write like that, and it took him a long time. And his dad said, "No, you just need to start earlier." Roger's dad always involved him to get involved in sports, and he taught Roger to catch and throw a volleyball and play backyard football. At age 12, Roger managed to win a spot on the football team. Before every game, he would visualize scoring a touchdown. And one day, he got a chance. He was out there on the field, and the ball landed in his arms, and he took off running as fast as he could. And one of the other players grabbed him, and they grabbed his artificial leg, and he couldn't shake the player, but his leg came off. And not knowing what to do, he hopped to the goal line and made a touchdown. He said, even better than scoring the 6 points was to see the kid's face who was holding his leg. His love for sports grew, and so did his self-confidence. But you know, not every obstacle gave way to his determination. Eating in the lunchroom was particularly painful. And he failed typing. He said, "I learned a very good lesson in typing class. You can't do everything, so it's better to concentrate on the thing you can do." And one thing that he could do is swing a tennis racket. But the thing is, when he swung it hard, he didn't have enough grip, and it launched like a rocket into space. But he stumbled on an odd-looking tennis racket at a sports store, and it had a wedge. It had a hole in it. He could wedge his fingers between the double-barrel handle when he picked it up, and it made it possible for him to swing, serve, and volley just like an able-bodied player. And he practiced every day, and he was soon playing and losing, and then playing and winning. He went on to college and played college tennis. Finished his career with 22 wins and 11 losses. He became the first physically handicapped tennis player to be certified as a tennis professional, as a teaching professional by the United States Professional Tennis Association. And now he tours the country, and he speaks to groups about what it takes to be a winner, knowing that you have more than enough. This is a quote from Roger. "The only difference between you and me is that you can see my handicap, and I can't see yours. We all have them. When people ask me how I've been able to overcome my physical handicaps, I tell them that I haven't overcome anything. I've simply learned what I can't do, such as play the piano or eat with chopsticks. But more importantly, I've learned what I can do, and then I do it with all my heart and all my soul. Roger doesn't resist what he can't do. That's the first thing we have to do, is to trust in God to see us through and just not resist, and to know that there's more than enough. The second thing that Paul and his companions did is to begin casting overboard things of less significance in order to save that which had greater significance, greater value. And if you and I want to be at peace in this world, and we want to be the change that we want to see, I think we need to be about figuring out what is significant. I was fretting over all that's been going on about getting into the new building. And my prayer partner, Reverend Pat Bessie, said, "Well, Beth, you wanted to play in a bigger arena. You wanted to be a bigger church. And guess what? Now you get bigger concerns." And then she went on to remind me. She said, "Just remember, 2 years from now, it won't matter." In 2017, this little stuff about when we're going to move, won't matter. This will have had no eternal significance. So for us to be at peace, you and I have to know what we value, what is significant in our lives. We can never find inner peace when we have one value and we live another. And so I gave you a handout this morning. It's for your own reflection. It's about what are your values. I know that when I did this sheet in another setting, I spent some time just, in the quiet, and I looked at the things I marked, and then I thought about my life, and I thought about where was my life not in alignment with my values. And, there were places where I had conflicting values, and so I had to prioritize. Doing anything with this sheet is purely optional. If you didn't get one, there's stacks of them. You can get them later. Yet I would invite you to take them home, and sometime today or this week, maybe spend a little time with this activity. And if you want to make an appointment to come talk with me about it, the implications and the outcomes, I'd be honored that. And if you stay for our adults discussion group, I actually have another handout for us to use in conjunction with this values handout. But what becomes paramount to us is what we value. And this year, we're going to be looking collectively about what is our community value. What are the things that are most important for this community? The third thing out of the story that I got was that I noted that it seemed to me that Paul kept a positive attitude. He didn't seem to be gnashing his teeth. And have you ever noticed how easy it is to see a bad attitude in somebody else? And when I get a bad attitude, what Gerald says is your blood sugar is low. It's funny that we don't see our own bad attitude. So some of the less significant things that we might need to cast overboard would be bad attitudes, pride, our rights, our hurt feelings, any unforgiveness. I love the story about Thomas Edison. In 1914, his laboratory was destroyed by fire, and the damage exceeded $2 million. And the buildings were only insured for $238,000 because they were made of concrete, and it was thought to be fireproof. much of his life's work went up in spectacular flames that December 9th. At the height of the fire, his 24-year-old son Charles frantically looked for his dad, and he finally found him just calmly watching the scene, his face glowing in the reflection and his white hair blowing in the wind. I can just get that picture. And Charles said, my heart ached for him. He was 67 years old, no longer a young man, and everything was going up in flames. And when Thomas Edison saw his son, he said, Charles, where's your mom? And Charles said he didn't know. He said, well, go find her. She'll never see anything like this in her life as long as she lives. And the next morning he looked at the ruins and he said, there is great value in disaster. All of our mistakes are burned up. Thank God we can start anew. 3 weeks after the fire, he managed to deliver his first phonograph. He could have said, well, I am 67 and my life's work is gone. But he didn't make that choice. He chose to have a good attitude. He chose to see that he had only lost that which was not important, all of his mistakes. Paul and his companions stopped resisting the wind. They cast overboard that which wasn't important, and they took nourishment. And so I would say that sometimes you and I have to take nourishment, and I would say that that nourishment might be called prayer meditation. It might be focusing on the big T truth, that there's more than enough, that we can trust God. We teach that, we say that every Sunday. There's only one God, and that God is absolutely good. We teach that we're co-creators with God, with the thoughts we think and the words we speak. So pausing and taking time to remember that helps us to get centered. I find it very easy to be at peace when everything is going the way I want it to be. It's much harder to be at peace when they're not. But our challenge is to be peace through and through, individually and collectively, all the time. And that's why, as a spiritual community, we are invested in bringing opportunities to you for spiritual and emotional maturity. And some of those opportunities come in the form of something called Be Peace, or the Connection Practice. A class called the Art and Practice of Living with Nothing and No One Against You. In February, we're having a week of spiritual education and enlightenment with faculty from Unity. And we have other classes and other workshops that are offered. We give you handouts. All of these are opportunities for us to move forward. For us to work on those strands of violence that live within us. Mother Teresa said, I know God will not give me anything I can't handle. Sometimes I just wish He didn't trust me so much. No matter what you see on the news, no matter what's going on in your life, remember, God is trusting us to be at peace.